Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. In the summer of 1969, hundreds of thousands of young Americans converged on a farm in upstate New York for the now legendary Woodstock Music and Arts Fair. Did Woodstock mark the end of the 60s, as some say, or was it the beginning of a countercultural revolution that is still playing itself out in American society? Joining us to sort through the conflict and the consensus are Kurt Vonnegut, novelist and social critic and author of more than a score of books, including Slaughterhouse, 5, Cat's Cradle, and Breakfast of Champions. Martha Bayles, author of Hole in Our Soul, The Loss of Beauty and Meaning in American Popular Music, and an editorial consultant for our program. Morris Dickstein, professor of English at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and author of The Gates of Eden, American Culture in the 60s. And Jim Miller, professor of political science at the New School for Social Research and author of Democracy is in the Streets, From Port Huron to the Siege of Chicago. The question before this house: did Woodstock change America? This week on Think Tank. In 1969, close to 500,000 self-described hippies, flower children, and Aquarians made a pilgrimage to Woodstock in upstate New York.
By the time we got to Woodstock, we were 500,000 strong.
The Woodstock Music and Arts Festival was called an Aquarian Exposition and hailed as 3 days of peace and music, and it was peaceful. But the times were not. America seemed to be dividing. The war in Vietnam went on and on. More American boys were still being sent to Southeast Asia by newly elected President Nixon. The increasingly unpopular war intensified a campus protest movement. Burning draft cards and peace marches became daily fare on the evening news. And not all the demonstrations were peaceful. The previous summer, after Martin Luther King was assassinated, riots broke out in 125 cities. And at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, the anti-war movement tore the Democratic Party in two. Both critics and fans concede that Woodstock has become part of the mythology of the 1960s, even if the actual event didn't necessarily represent the musical or political taste of most young Americans at the time. Some say it symbolized the freedom and idealism of the 1960s. Critics argue that Woodstock represented much of what was wrong with the 60s, a glorification of drugs, a loosening of sexual morality, and a socially corrosive disrespect for authority. 25 years later, the debate still rages about the meaning of Woodstock, and more importantly, about the legacy of those who attended it, in person or in spirit. Martha Bayles, welcome. Welcome to you all. What happened at Woodstock? Is Woodstock a legitimate symbol of the 60s, of the counterculture?
I think Woodstock is laden with a lot of symbolic meaning, and that's why we're arguing about it, and we still talk about it. But the meanings are numerous. Woodstock was a mixed bag. To the hardcore left, in 1969, Woodstock was nothing but a rock concert. It wasn't a demonstration. And a lot of people criticize it on that basis. Nowadays, when Woodstock is being compared to the highly commercialized Woodstock 94, it's seen as a sort of pure, spontaneous ingathering of free spirits practicing peace and love, when in fact it was a commercial venture, it was a rock concert, and without the profit motive and the presence of popular recording stars, it probably wouldn't have happened anyway. But there were some very positive things at Woodstock.
We'll
things that are positive about the 60s, and some negative things.
We're going to come back to that. Jim Miller, what about the Woodstock concert? Was that the apogee of something? Was it the beginning of a slide?
Well, the way I think that myths get hatched in the United States is always a strange mixture of reality and imagination. As a concert per se, it wasn't that important in terms of the large-scale history of rock and roll. I think that the fact that it happened in New York City that the media were close to it, magnified it out of all proportion, and once it had been so magnified, it became a symbol for all kinds of people. It became an image in the minds of people who weren't there of a way that you could experience music as a cultural lifestyle. It became a further emblem to the music industry that there was a market that they still had yet to fully tap. In the immediate sequel to Woodstock, there were numerous attempts to cash in.
You have
on
both
this
stressed a certain commercial aspect to this.
Yes.
Right.
And the third thing I would say is that in the long haul, it has become a convenient symbol for people who are hostile to what the spirit of the 60s, whatever that represents, it's become a convenient symbol for them and a target.
So for conservatives to be
yes.
against Woodstock.
Yeah.
Yeah. Morris Dickstein.
Well, Woodstock was commercial, but after all, it was a commercial disaster that was only recouped by the movie. And it's the movie that, as well as some media coverage, but mainly the movie, I think, that turned Woodstock into the enduring myth that it later became. So many people think they were at Woodstock, but they really only saw the movie. But
that's like that famous story of how many people claim they saw Babe Ruth point to hitting the home run.
And how few people voted for Richard Nixon.
And how few people voted for right.
It didn't really represent all of the 60s. It represented those strands of the counterculture rather than the political side of the 60s, but it had its own politics because, as your introductory piece said, it took place in the context of the war, so all those days of peace and love amid chaos and disorganization really was a way of acting out a kind of lifestyle protest against the wars, assassinations, and the whole violence side of the 60s that tends to get stressed more in media stereotypes.
Kurt Vonnegut, you were one of the cultural icons at that time, like it or not.
I never showed myself to my people, and I had 4 kids who were of proper age to go to Woodstock, and they simply were not interested, although they were pacifists and outraged at the government and so forth. They were attracted to peace marches, to sit-ins, to teach-ins, and political demonstrations. And we were talking just in the green room about how much I missed Abbie Hoffman. He was a great man. He was a useful man for focusing attention on the outrages, many injustices and nuttinesses in our society. And Woodstock did none of that, I guess. You said it was politically useless.
Well, one of the reasons why there's this flowery, lovely myth about Woodstock is because it was, compared to some of the other things that were going on in 1969, rather benign. In 1969, SDS had split into the Weatherman faction.
Students for Democratic Society, which was the hard left of the student movement.
It was the student political organization. Right. It split into the Weatherman faction, which was rather the kind of terrorist wannabes at that point. I mean, they were very hung up on the idea of whether they could commit violence. I think partly because they knew people their own age were fighting and dying in Vietnam, and that was a problem for them. And it was partly because of the black movement, which they very much were copying and emulating, was very much out of its nonviolent and into its violent stage.
I think one problem.
So Woodstock was a lot of kids at Woodstock were not into that kind of politics, and as a result, they weren't into politics especially at all.
I think one problem was that those benign images, I think, angered a lot of people in Middle America more than even the images of protest. I think there were some people inspired by images of all this sex and love and free, especially the peaceful atmosphere of Woodstock. The idea of childlike innocence, I think, inspired some people with the desire to kill. You know, inspired at least other people with. I think it probably is the ancestor of our culture wars today, because what we think of as the move towards fundamentalism, the new right, family values, really did emerge as a reaction to that countercultural ethos in the 60s.
Well, one of the things I think that comes up when you look at it's interesting that the public opinion polls today is that the American people are afraid, or many of the American people are afraid, that Bill and Hillary Clinton sort of represent, quotes, the 60s. Or that part of them.
But Bill Clinton was the guy running for class president then. He was not the guy.
Yeah, but he was also allegedly dodging the draft and doing a few other, and not inhaling and a few other things. I mean, you know, it's a complex story.
This brings up the third thing that Woodstock was. It was a rock concert. It was not a political demonstration. What it really was, though, on another level, was it was something that's deeply in the American grain. It was kind of a revival meeting, and there was a quality about Woodstock that smacked of the outdoor camp meeting, the Methodist camp meeting.
Why has this hung on as a symbol? Is that how things work? I mean, times get sort of attached to a specific event, and
I think it represents a very primitive need in all of us, which is seldom acknowledged. I think at our peril we do without vitamin C, for instance. At our peril we do without a tribe, without a without a support system. A nuclear family is not a support system. It's hideously vulnerable, and so we again and again join gangs. Is for most of the 7 million years there have been human beings, we have lived in families of 50 or 100. Now, the people who talk about family values, Dan Quayle, for instance, from my hometown, he has an extended family. He might as well be an Igbo in Nigeria. He has lawyers, cousins, National Guardsmen, generals.
You mean that as a compliment?
Yes. No, everybody should have what he has.
We should all be so fortunate.
And when somebody like Quayle talks about family values, yeah, we'd like to have families too, as most of us don't, but he's got one.
And in fact, it was called, I mean, the whole thing was called The Movement.
Yeah.
That was an extended family.
The funny thing about that period, though, is there are so many events that mark the period where not just an extended family, but 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 people got together. And no matter what happened, whether it was the music being played that very few people could hear because of the bad sound system, or whether it was the political demonstration in Washington where nobody listened to the speeches, but just being there was the thing, there was a sense of a larger community. And we may think of it as a very thin idea of community, but it was a sense of an alienated part of the culture, a youth culture that had been building at least since Catcher in the Rye 20 years earlier, getting together and asserting itself with its various generational anthems. And that was a key element in creating that sense of a support system that Kurt just mentioned.
It strikes me that there's another dark side of this that's worth bringing in to the picture here, which is just a few days before Woodstock. It's worth remembering the family that murdered Sharon Tate.
Yeah.
And that Charlie Manson was a version of what could come out of this kind of pseudo-tribalism in a drug-addled atmosphere.
Exactly.
And that there's a way in which Woodstock, I wonder how the media would have played it if they had known at the time, which they didn't, that Manson was, in his own way, as legitimate a hippie as anybody who went to Woodstock.
Let me ask a question. I sort of come out of the political arena. And in fact, I had, during that Vietnam War, I had worked on President Johnson's staff, so we come from rather different backgrounds. How representative of American young people were the people at Woodstock, or even the Woodstock Nation? I mean, I'll just cite a couple of poll results from the time that I recall, which was that young people were more pro-Vietnam War than adults were. Young people were more pro-George Wallace than adults were. And in 1972, in that general era, a majority of young people voted against George McGovern and for Richard Nixon. So how was this typical America? Was this, or are we talking about a thin elite fringe that got the media attention?
This is a function of education. Is ignorant people
like me, right? Right.
who are for the war and so forth. No, these were educated people. They were middle class. I think it'd be attacked on class grounds, probably, as to who they were.
Well, the countercultural middle class also. I mean, there's a book called Woodstock Nation that shows that 93% of the counterculture were middle class. I think the fallacy there is a numbers game. I mean, there are always a lot of people who are living the way their parents lived and the way their grandparents lived. It's just that I think a fairly large part of that generation, that boomer generation, was represented some form of alienation, whether radical or mild and so on, really represented a sense of having different values from their parents who were the World War II generation or the 40s and 50s generation. And it's that generation that tried to assert itself at Woodstock.
Let's try to move on now from the event of Woodstock to the consequences of Woodstock. And let me see if I can try it out in a provocative way. What we saw at Woodstock and from the 60s, among other things, was the drug culture, was sexual promiscuity, and we could argue about this, was pacifism, and I would say that if we had remained or became a pacifist nation, we would not have won the Cold War, much to the dismay of people around the world. So what are the consequences of Woodstock?
I think it was a failed project because a lot of young people believed in peace and love, but they didn't have a very good guide as to what peaceful or loving actions really were. And it was very much about personal liberation and not very much about how to treat other people. How to treat other people became a very confused and chaotic issue for a lot of young people. Even if they weren't at Woodstock or they weren't at the extremes, there was a lot of moral confusion. And by moral confusion, I mean how to treat other people. And if you add in the toxic emotions that are brought about by drug abuse, you have a recipe for real disaster. And people who felt mistreated by their friends and their lovers and so forth in the 60s were always accused of having middle-class hang-ups. You know, hey, you know, what's your problem? Why do you object to what I just did to you? You know, you're just hung up on middle-class morality. And that affected a lot of people. I don't know how the polls would measure that, but that affected a lot of people.
Kurt, are we a better country because of the 60s today?
Yes, I think so. That the 60s taught us that we can build an extended family and unify ourselves with music. Feminism did not come out of the 60s. As I talked to any number of women who were the right age to be involved, who were treated abominably as slaves, as gophers.
Well, I sum it up this way. In the 60s, men liberated themselves from the demands made on them traditionally by women. In the 70s, women liberated themselves from the demands traditionally made by men.
On the same model that the men had used.
And the tragedy is that they both
blacks had used and so on.
They both liberated themselves from the demands made by children.
I would say that the big split is between the people with sensitive humor and people who are humorless.
That's always a problem.
It's all has to go on this way, you know, it's real world politics and we have this example of a country being able to go absolutely nuts in Germany. And so we could start that way with these military adventures. And
are you talking about now?
No.
Oh, you're not talking about
No, I'm talking about the Vietnam War, which was finally, it had to be brought to an end somehow.
Well, I would describe it a little differently. Woodstock represented a failed utopianism that very easily got commercialized and I think very easily got turned into style. I mean, what happened, the people who were in their own way protesting the war and other things at Woodstock were acting out a criticism not by going to the ballot box, but by the way they dressed, the clothes they wore, various kinds of mores that got the label lifestyle later on. And the counterculture, unlike the New Left, the counterculture was very amenable to being turned into something that could easily be commercialized.
I think I really disagree with you. I think actually I would put it almost the other way around, that the New Left, which I've written a book about, I think ultimately isn't that important politically, and it didn't have that great an impact, except indirectly by sparking a middle-class peace movement. The counterculture, precisely because it was picked up and shoved into the marketplace, spread the ethos of the 60s in the early 70s, and in the process of what you're, I think, denigrating as style or fashion, actually changed the culture and changed it in ways.
Changed, for example, our sexual mores?
It changed sexual mores, it changed attitudes towards authority, it changed a sense of what was permissible to experiment with, what limits could be toyed with. What drove them home in American culture was the marketing through rock and roll, among other things, through film, of a certain fantasy of freedom that to me has connections, say, with Randolph Bourne, early progressive bohemians, but it becomes a mass artifact.
What did it do to our music?
Well, I agree with Jim. I think that our commercial system has the ability to amplify, magnify, and multiply and popularize any cultural change. And this does make the counterculture different from previous forms of bohemianism. It became a mass phenomenon, which Morris has written about
marketing.
also.
It's not just the marketing. I think that what happened is that it's in that original reaction to Woodstock and the counterculture. Middle America looked at that with a combination of hostility and envy.
Not young Middle America.
Well, no, I think they did. I think that in one sense they felt that the traditional values were threatened by the new mores represented by the counterculture. In another sense, they thought, God, I wish I were young now, or I wish I were involved in this. There was a kind of deep sexual fantasy and fantasy of freedom involved. That was part of the marketing and so on. And what happened is that gradually this was shorn of any political context it might have had and entirely personalized and turned into the kind of transformation of cultural mores that you described.
Let me return to that political context for a moment. The component parts of the movement, one could say it started with civil rights, and then it accumulated feminism and environmentalism and consumerism.
No, the Vietnam War would be the
and the peace movement. Who would accept here the idea that there was some good in each one of those movements?
I would.
But
We all would.
wait a minute. But they each went too far.
Everything that makes an impact goes too far. In other words, things that are moderate and easy and so on do not really make an impact. What happens is that there's some transformational push, and eventually a lot of it drops away and doesn't really have its effect, but some of it sticks and becomes part of this permanent cultural change that Jim was describing. And I think every one of those movements that you described had that effect.
Kurt,
Also
did it go too far? Did these movements go too far?
No, I would like to see them all. So many of them go much farther. It's environmentalism, for instance, which you mentioned. And so I think you're right. A movement is a failure, really, if it doesn't go too far.
If I look back on what I think is good about the 60s from my own perspective, that of a white person with a privileged background, okay? One of the nice things about the 60s, the positive things about the 60s, was it encouraged you to pay serious attention to what life was like for the people on the other side of the tracks. The way it went too far was that a lot of the radical political part of the movement had fantasies about those people and never really understood them very well, and particularly with blacks, this incredible fantasy of blacks as violent and super alienated, this panther fantasy that the left had, I think has been extremely destructive.
Try to sum up for us and for our audience, what do you all agree upon and what do you disagree upon?
I think everything that we look back to the 60s and think about, including the counterculture, has its upside, its positive side, in terms of the liberation, the easing, the relaxing of American mores that many of us grew up with in the 1950s, and also has its side in which it went too far. In other words, the sense that it unleashed all sorts of demons that we see today in the culture wars.
Kurt, what do we agree upon? What do we disagree upon?
Well, I think that probably an important movement was going invisibly in the universities, in the coffee houses, among intelligent people prepared to do political work, and so concerts really had nothing to do with it. But it seems after the fact, an awful lot of important devoted thinking has come out of the 60s relative to rescuing the planet, to questioning authority on military adventures and so forth. And so it happened.
As we prepare to invade Haiti.
Yes, I'm ready, I'm going. And
There is a skepticism that can't be put aside.
yeah, but I think it happened in the souls of many of us, and of course those are invisible.
Jim.
Above all else, an experiment in living that was shared and collective, not shared by everybody. Like a real experiment, we learn through mistakes, but to speak just for myself, I would do it all over again.
Martha?
I think
last shot.
I think we agree there were angels at Woodstock and also devils, and we may disagree somewhat about which was which.
All right. Thank you, Martha Bayles, Jim Miller, Morris Dickstein, and Kurt Vonnegut. And thank you. We are very happy to hear from our viewers. Please send any comments or questions to the address on the screen. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.